Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. How much has changed in such a short time? A year ago, I stood here, I told some truths about the state of the Western world that were received with some surprise and amazement by a good part of the political, economic, and media establishment of the West. And I must admit that in some sense I understand. A president of a country that, as a result of economic and systematic failure for more than 100 years, as a result of having taken faint-hearted positions in major global conflicts, and as a result of having closed ourselves to trade, had lost practically all international relevance over the years. A president of that country stands on this dais and tells the whole world that they are wrong, that they are heading for failure, that the West has gone astray, and that it must be put back on track. A president of that country, Argentina, who was not a politician, who had no legislative support, who had no support from governors or businessmen or media groups. In that speech here, standing in front of you, I told you that it was the beginning of a new Argentina. That Argentina had been infected with socialism for too long, and that with us it was going to re-embrace the ideas of freedom. A model that we summarize in the defense of life, liberty, and private property. And I also told you that, in some sense, Argentina was the ghost of the future Christmas of the West, because we had already lived everything that you were living, and we already knew how it would end. A year later, I have to say that I don't feel so lonely anymore. I don't feel so lonely, because the world has embraced Argentina. Argentina has become a global example of fiscal responsibility, of commitment to our obligations, of how to end the problem and inflation, and also of a new way of doing politics that consists of telling the truth to people's faces, and trusting that people will understand. Nor do I feel alone, because throughout this year, I have been able to find companions in this fight for the ideas of freedom. In all corners of the planet, from the wonderful Elon Musk to the fierce Italian lady, my dear friend Giorgia Meloni. From Bukele in El Salvador to Viktor Orban in Hungary, from Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, to Donald Trump in the United States. Slowly, an international alliance has been forming of all those nations that want to be free and that believe in the ideas of freedom. And slowly, what seemed like an absolute hegemony at the global level of the walk left in politics, in educational institutions, in the media, in supranational organizations, or in forums such as Davos, has been unraveling. And a hope for the ideas of freedom is beginning to glimpse. Today I come here to tell you that our battle is not won, that although hope has been reborn, it is our moral duty and our historical responsibility to dismantle the ideological edifice of Sikhuism. Until we have managed to rebuild our historic cathedral, until we have managed to get the majority of Western countries to re-embrace the ideas of freedom, until our ideas are not the common currency of the halls of events like this, we will not be able to lower our arms because I must say, forums like this have been protagonists and promoters of the sinister agenda of wokeism that is doing so much damage to it by accident. If we want to change, if we really want to defend the rights of citizens, we must first start by telling them the truth. And the truth is that there is something deeply wrong with the ideas that have been promoted from forums like this, and I would like to take a few minutes from this day to discuss some of them. Few people today deny that the winds of change are blowing in the West. There are those who resist change. There are those who accept it reluctantly, but accept it at last. There are the new converts who seem when they see it as inevitable, and finally, there are those who have fought a lifetime for its advent. Each one of you will know in which group you recognize yourself. Surely there is a little bit of each one in this auditorium. But all of you will surely recognize that the time of change is knocking on the door. The moments of historical change have a particularity. They are times when the formulas that were in force for decades are exhausted. The ways considered unique of doing things cease to make sense, and what for many will be unquestionable truths are finally put into doubt. These are times when the rules are rewritten, and that's why they are times that reward those who have the courage to take risks. But a good part of the free world still prefers the comfort of the known even if it is the wrong way, and insists on applying the recipes of failure. And the great anvil that appears as a common denominator in countries and institutions that are failing is the mental virus of the woke ideology. This is the great epidemic of our time that must be cured. It is the cancer that must be extirpated. This ideology has colonized the most important institutions in the world, from the parties and states of the free countries of the West, to global governance organizations, through non-governmental institutions, universities and the media, as well as has marked the course of the global conversation during the last decades. Until we remove this aberrant ideology from our culture, our institutions and our laws, Western civilization, and even the human species, will not be able to return to the path of progress demanded by our pioneering spirit. It is essential to break these ideological chains if we want to take a step towards a new golden era. That's why I want to take a few minutes today to destroy those chains. But first, let's talk about what we are fighting for. The West represents the peak of the human species, the fertile land of its Greco-Roman heritage, and its Judeo-Christian values, were planted the seeds of something unprecedented in history. After imposing itself definitively on absolutism, Iberism inaugurated a new era in human existence. Within this new moral and philosophical framework that put individual freedom above the whim of the tyrant, the West was able to unleash man's creative capacity, starting a process of wealth generation never seen before. The data speak for themselves. Until the year 1800, the GDP per capita of the world remained practically constant. However, since the 19th century, and thanks to the Industrial Revolution, GDP per capita increased 20-fold, lifting 90% of the world's population out of poverty, even though the population increased 8-fold. This was only possible thanks to a convergence of fundamental values, respect for life, liberty and property, which made possible free trade, freedom of expression, religious freedom, and the rest of the pillars of Western civilization. Added to this, our inventive, exploratory, pioneering Faustian spirit, which is always testing the limits of the possible. A pioneering spirit that today is represented, among others, by my dear friend Elon Musk, who has been unjustly vilified by the guaquismo in the last few hours for an innocent gesture, that all it means is his negotiation and gratitude to the people. In short, we invented capitalism based on savings, investment, work, reinvestment, and hard work. We managed to ensure that each worker could multiply his productivity by 10, 100, or why not, even by 1,000, thus overcoming the Malthusian trap. However, at some point in the 20th century, we lost our way, and the liberal principles that had made us free and prosperous were betrayed. A new political class, protected by collectivist ideologies and taking advantage of moments of crisis, saw a perfect opportunity to accumulate power. All the wealth created by capitalism up to that moment and in the future would be redistributed under some centralized planning scheme where the initial starting point to a process whose dire consequences we are suffering today. Pushing a socialist agenda, but insidiously operating within the liberal paradigm, this new political class distorted the values of liberalism. Thus, they replaced freedom with liberation, using the coercive power of the state to distribute the wealth created by capitalism. Its justification was the sinister, unjust, and aberrant idea of social justice complemented by Marxist theoretical frameworks, whose aim was to free the individual from his needs. And in the background of this new scheme of values, the fundamental premise of which equality before the law is not enough, since there are injustices of hidden bases that must be rectified. which represents a goldmine for bureaucrats with aspirations of omnipotence. This is fundamentally what hollowness consists of. It is the result of the inversion of Western values. Each of the pillars of our civilization was changed by a distorted version of itself, by introducing various mechanisms of its cultural version. From the facts, from the negative rights to life, liberty, and property, we pass to an artificially infinite amount of positive rights. First it was education, then housing, and from the ridiculous things like internet access, football, television, theater, cosmetic treatments, and countless more desires that became fundamental human rights, rights that of course someone has to pay, and that can only be guaranteed through the infinite expansion of the aberrant state. In other words, from the concept of freedom as the fundamental protection of the individual against the intervention of the tyrant, we passed to the concept of liberation through the intervention of the state. On this basis, Ukism was built, a regime of unique thought, supported by different institutions whose purpose is to penalize dissent. Feminism, diversity, inclusion, equity, immigration, abortion, environmentalism, gender ideology, among others, are heads of the same creature whose purpose is to justify the advancement of the state through the appropriation and distortion of noble causes. Let's see some. Radical feminism is a distortion of the concept of equality, and even in its most benevolent version, it is redundant, since equality before the law already exists in the West. Everything else is the pursuit of privilege, which is what radical feminism really aims at, putting one half of the population against the other when they should be on the same side. We have even reached the point of normalizing that in many supposedly civilized countries, if one kills a woman, it is called femicide. And that carries a more serious penalty than if one kills a man just for the sex of the victim, legalizing, in fact, that a woman's life is worth more than a man's, flying the flag of the gender wage gap. But when one looks at the data, it is evident that there is no inequality for the same task, but that most men tend to professions that pay better than most women. However, they do not complain that most of the prisoners are men, or that most of the plumbers are men, or that most of the victims of theft or ascent are men, and let alone most of the people who died in wars. But if one raises these issues from the media, or even from this forum, they label us as misogynists just for the fact that we defend an elementary principle of moderna democracy and the rule of law, which is equality before the law and data. Wokism, moreover, manifests itself in the sinister radical environmentalism and the banner of climate change. Preserving our planet for future generations is a matter of common sense. No one wants to live in a garbage dump. But again, Wokismo was arranged to pervert that elementary idea of preserving the environment for the enjoyment of human beings. We passed a fanatical environmentalism where human beings are a cancer that must be eliminated, and economic development is little less than a crime against nature. However, when one argues that the Earth has already had 5 cycles of sudden temperature changes, and that man did not even exist in 4 of them, we are branded as flat earthers to discredit our ideas, regardless of whether science and data are on our side. It is no coincidence that these same people are the main promoters of the murderous and murderous agenda of abortion, an agenda designed from the Malthusian premises that overpopulation is going to destroy the Earth, and therefore, we must implement some mechanism of population control. In fact, this has already been to the extent that the population growth rate is starting to become a problem on the planet today. What a task they were sent with these aberrations of abortion. From these forums, the LGBT agenda is promoted, wanting to impose on us that women are men and men are women, only if they perceive themselves that way, and say nothing about when a man disguises himself as a woman and kills his rival in a boxing ring, or when a prisoner alleges to be a woman and ends up raping every woman who crosses his path in prison. Without going any further, a few weeks ago, the case of 2 homosexual Americans who, flying the flag of sexual diversity, made headlines around the world and were sentenced to 100 years in prison for abusing and filming their adopted children for more than 2 years. I want to be clear that when I say abuse, it is not a euphemism, because in its most extreme versions, gender ideology simply constitutes child abuse. They are pedophiles. Therefore, I want to know who endorses these behaviors. They are irreversibly harming healthy children through hormonal treatments and mutilations, as if a child under the age of 5 could consent to such a thing. And if it happens that his family does not agree, there will always be state agents ready to intercede on behalf of what they call the interest of the minor. Believe me that the scandalous experiments that are being carried out today in the name of this criminal ideology will be condemned, and compared with those that occurred during the darkest epochs of our history. And covering this multitude of abject practices is the eternal victimhood, always ready to fire accusations of homophobia, transphobia, and other inventions whose sole purpose is to try to silence those who denounce this scandal, that the national and international authorities are accomplices. On the other hand, in our companies, public institutions, and houses of studies, merit was set aside by the doctrine of diversity, which implies a retreat towards the noble systems of yesteryear. Quotas are invented for as many minorities as politicians can think of, that all they are doing is attacking the excellence of those institutions. Quoquism has also distorted the cause of immigration. The free movement of goods and people are at the foundations of liberalism. We know it well. Argentina, the United States, and many other countries were made great by those immigrants who left their homelands in search of new opportunities. However, from trying to attract foreign talent to promote development, we have gone through mass immigration, motivated not from the national interest but from guilt. Since the West is the supposed cause of all the ills of history, it must redeem itself by opening its borders to everyone, necessarily culminating in a reverse colonization that resembles collective suicide. This is how we see today in the images of hordes of immigrants who abuse, rape, or kill European citizens, who only committed the sin of not having adhered to a particular religion. But when one questions these situations, one is branded as a racist, xenophobic, or Nazi. Wokismo has penetrated so deeply into our societies, promoted by institutions such as this one, that it has even come to question the very idea of sex through the nefarious gender ideology. This has led to even greater state intervention through absurd legislation, such as the one in which the state has to finance hormones and missionary surgeries to fulfill the self-perception of certain individuals. Just today, we are seeing the effects of a whole generation mutilated his body promoted by a culture of sexual relativity that will have to spend his entire life in psychiatric treatment to face what was done, but no one says about these issues. Not only that, they have also subjected the vast majority to being slaves of the wrong ones to the self-perceptions of a tiny majority. And in addition, Wokism intends to hijack our future. Because by dominating the chairs of the most prestigious universities in the world, it is forming the elites of our countries to challenge and deny the culture, ideas, and values that made us great, further injuring our social fabric. What do we have left for the future if we are teaching our young people to feel shame for our past? All this was incubated and developed in an increasingly noticeable way during the last decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Interestingly, free countries began to self-destruct when they ran out of adversaries to defeat. The peace made us weak. We were defeated by our own complacency. All these and other aberrations that for reasons of time we cannot list are the ones that threaten the West today, and are unfortunately the beliefs that institutions like this have promoted for 40 years. No one can pretend to be innocent here. They have surrendered, hidden for decades to a sinister and murderous ideology as if it were a golden calf, and have moved heaven and earth to impose them on humanity. This same organization, and also the most influential supranational organizations, have been ideologues of this barbarism. The multilateral credit agencies have been an extortionate arm, and many national states, and in particular the European Union, have been and are an armed arm. Or maybe in the UC today they are not imprisoning citizens for revealing aberrant, really appalling, crimes committed by Muslim migrants that the government wants to hide. Or maybe the Brussels bureaucrats didn't suspend Romania's elections simply because they didn't like which party had won. In the face of each of these discussions, quoquism tries to discredit those who question these things by first taking you away from us, and then censoring us. If we are white, it must be racist. If you are a man, it must be misogynistic or a member of the patriarchy. If you are rich, it must be a cruel capitalist. If you are heterosexual, it must be heteronormative, homophobic or transphobic. For each questioning, they have a label that they then try to censor by de facto or de ways. Because underneath the discourse of diversity and democracy and tolerance that they claim to wield, what is really hidden is the manifest desire to destroy dissonance, criticism, and, in essence, freedom, in order to continue upholding a model of which they are the main beneficiaries. Or maybe we don't hear these days how certain important European authorities, quite red-faced to put it somehow, let's say, openly call for censorship, or that in reality there is no censorship, but those who think differently from the woke ideology should be silenced. And what kind of society can result from wokeism? A society that replaced the free exchange of goods and services by the arbitrary distribution of wealth at gunpoint, replaced free communities by forced collectivization, replaced the creative chaos of the market by the sterile and sclerotic order of socialism. A society full of resentment where there are only two types of people, those who are net taxpayers on the one hand, and those who are beneficiaries of the state on the other. And I do not mean by this to those who receive their social existence because they have nothing to eat. I am talking about the privileged corporations. I am talking about the bankers who were rescued in the subprime crisis, about the majority of the media, about the indoctrination centers disguised as universities, about the state bureaucracy, about the unions, about social organizations, about the state-sponsored enterprises, and about all the sectors that live off the taxes paid by those who work. I'm talking about the world that Rand describes in Atlas Shrugged, which has unfortunately come to fruition. A scheme where the big winner is the political class that becomes in turn the arbiter and interested party of this deal. I repeat, the political class is the arbiter and interested party in this deal, and as always, the one who deals gets the best part. Where, beneath the cosmetic differences between the different parties, interests, partners, arrangements, and an unalterable commitment are shared so that nothing changes, because that's what called all of them, the party of the state. A system that hides behind well-thinking speeches, where, according to them, the market fails, and they are the ones in charge of solving said failures with regulations, force, and bureaucracy. But there are no market failures. I repeat again, there are no market failures. Given that the market is a mechanism of social cooperation where property rights are voluntarily exchanged, the alleged market failures are a contradiction in their own terms. The only thing that generates such intervention are new distortions in the price system, which in turn hinders economic calculation, savings, and investment, and therefore ultimately end up generating more poverty, or an unclean tangle of regulations, for example, like the one that exists in Europe, killing economic growth. As I usually say in my presentations, if you consider that there is a market failure, go and check if the state is not in the middle. And if you find that it is not, do the analysis again because it is wrong. For that very reason, since quoquism is nothing more or less than a systematic plan of the state party to justify state intervention and increased public spending, this means that our first crusade, the most important one if we want to recover the West of progress, if we want to build a new golden era, has to be the drastic reduction of the size of the state, not only in each of our countries, but also the drastic reduction of all supranational organizations, because it is the only way to cut corners with this perverse system. By draining the resources to return to the paymaster tax what is yours and end the sale of favors. There is no better method than eliminating the state bureaucracy so that there is no possibility of selling such favors. The functions of the state must again be limited to the defense of the right to life, liberty, and property. Any other function that the state arrogates to itself will be to the detriment of its fundamental task, and will inexorably culminate in the omnipresent Leviathan that we all suffer from today. Today, we are witnessing a global exhaustion of this system that has dominated us in recent decades. As happened in Argentina, in the rest of the world, the only relevant conflict of this century, and all those that have already passed, is accentuating the conflict between free citizens and the political caste that clings to the established order, redoubling its efforts of censorship, persecution, and destruction. Fortunately, throughout the free world, there is a silenced majority that is organizing, and in every corner of our hemisphere the echo of this cry for freedom resounds. We are facing a change of era, a Copernican turn, the destruction of one paradigm and the construction of another. And if the institutions influence global as this House wants to turn the page and participate in good faith of this new paradigm, will have to take responsibility for the role they played in these last decades, and recognize before society the mea culpa that is claimed from them. To close, I want to speak directly to the leaders of the world, to all those who lead so many national states, as well as large economic groups and international organizations, both those present here and those who are not listening from their homes. The political formulas of the last decades that I have set out in this speech have failed and are collapsing on themselves. This means that thinking as everyone thinks, reading what everyone reads, saying what everyone says, can only lead to error, even if there are still many who persist in walking towards the precipice. The script of the last 40 years has been exhausted, and when a system runs out, the story opens. That's why I say to all global leaders, it's time to get out of that script, it's time to be bold. It's time to encourage yourself to think, and to encourage yourself to write your own verses. Because when the ideas and texts of the present say all the same, and say the wrong things, being brave consists precisely in being extemporaneous. It consists in going back, in not being dazzled by the passengers, losing sight of the universal. It consists of recovering truths that for our antecedents were girlfriends, and that are at the base of the civilizational success that the West has been, but that the regime of single thought of the last decades persecuted as if they were heresies. As Churchill once said, the further back we look, the further ahead we can see. That is, we have to rediscover forgotten truths from our past in order to untie the knot of the present, and take the next step forward as a civilization towards the future. And what do I see when I look back? That we must once again embrace the latest proven theses of economic and social success, that is, the model of freedom. Re-embrace the ideas of freedom, return to liberalism. That is what we are doing in Argentina. That is what I trust President Trump will do in this new North America. And that is what we invite all the great nations of the world to do. Free and intend to stop in time what by all accounts is a path that leads to catastrophe. In short, what I am proposing to you is that we make the West great again. Today, as 215 years ago, Argentina has broken its chains and invites, as our anthem says, all the mortals of the world to hear the sacred cry freedom, freedom, freedom. May the power of heaven be with us. Thank you all so much and long live freedom, fuck.